Welcome, everyone. We are glad that you are joining us, and I'm very excited to introduce you to our guest and my summit co-host here, Ariel Schwartz. So this is a real treat to have you here, Ariel.
Thank you, Manuela. It's lovely to be here with you.
And I do want to do a little introduction, even though people probably know who you are. But Dr. Ariel Schwartz is a licensed clinical psychologist. She's certified complex trauma professional and a Kripalu yoga teacher. She has a private practice in Boulder, Colorado, and she has a very integrative mind-body approach to therapy, which includes relational therapy, parts work therapy, somatic psychology, EMDR, and therapeutic yoga for trauma. Ariel, it's awesome to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. I always enjoy our conversations, Manuela. I feel like we have such a kind of common perspective on the field and a shared background that it's just a joy to kind of feel that kind of like collegial support at my back.
Yeah, I feel the same. And I love also how both you and I are very integrative. So we weave in different strands of the somatic psychology field and always hungry for new learning. And I love that about you. You bring in so many beautiful modalities. And I want to kind of get started by asking you some of your influences as a somatic therapist. This is a long path. You are a teacher, you're a thought leader, you're a gifted speaker and therapist, and I'm sure there were all kinds of influences that got you here. So tell us about that.
Sure. So my initial experience in kind of embodiment that got me kind of hooked was about the age of 20. I went to a body mind centering workshop that came to my undergraduate college. And it was such a profound transformational experience for me. And maybe if I contextualize this for a moment with a little bit of a humorous story, I was a 20-year-old. I was a senior in college dating a freshman. Now, this is maybe TMI, but that's okay. Who was not at all interested. This young man was not at all, young boy, not at all interested in an attachment-based relationship, nor was I in that particular nor was I in that particular moment. But when I went to this body mind centering workshop, we, had these experiences of kind of like rocking on the floor and having our head held by another person and just rocked side to side and these very primitive movements that brought me into a felt sense of something that I hadn't really touched in myself. I also experienced an emotional opening that I came out of this session with that perhaps young, raw, perhaps tucked away part of me now much more on the surface and revealed, saying, I want attachment. I want someone that wants me back. I want someone that's going to commit. And I show back up to this young 17, 18-year-old, in this kind of newfound part of myself. And he's like, bye, see ya.
I can't handle that.
So, but all of that said in somewhat of a humorous vein, but I also touched a tremendous amount of my own pain, my own wounding from my childhood attachment experiences in that same process, like what opened up and that desire to find a partner, to find a path toward healing was in some ways less about the other and much more about repairing something within myself that then I spent the next probably 10 or so years just trying to sort my way through what had opened up. And between that experience of this body mind centering workshop and then also being exposed to yoga at a young age and then returning to it around that same time period, I had these accumulated moments of coming to my body and finding this experience of like, that feels like home, that feels like me, that feels like whole, that feels like self. I want more of that. And that's what brought me out here to Boulder, Colorado. And at the time, this was 1996 at this point. And at that time, there were only a few programs in the United States and perhaps even in the world where you could get a master's degree in body-centered psychotherapy. And Naropa was one of them. So I chose Naropa specifically because the mentors that I discovered here, actually, many of whom I'm interviewing as part of this summit, we're coming from that body mind centering perspective, an embodiment perspective, a Hakomi perspective, as well as a Gestalt perspective. So there was a dynamic and enlivened flow that I discovered here at Naropa. And I spent the next 3 years just in my own process of learning how to be a somatic therapist and also healing myself from the inside out. It was a little bit later than that when I kind of added in maybe the next key influence for myself as a somatic therapist, which was the field of interpersonal neurobiology. And maybe more specifically, Christine Caldwell, who I'm interviewing as part of this summit and who was the director of the Naropa program. She had her own passion in this field of interpersonal neurobiology, and it sparked that. And so I just kept reading more Dan Siegel's work, Alan Shore's work, and eventually Stephen Porges's work. So at that point, it all kind of launched me into this kind of real deep curiosity about how our embodiment is not something that solely exists within the self, but it's also what happens between us. There's this embodied social self that, in a way pulls it all together, that attachment lens and what opened up in me in that moment. So ever since 1996, when I began officially studying this, and that first experience, which was back in 1993, I have been on this kind of fervent search for understanding of why mind-body therapies heal. And then my dissertation research in my clinical psych PhD program was about how do we bridge the gap between the mind-body therapies and clinical practice.
What a beautiful path. And I love, because so many of your teachers were my teachers, and I'm an Naropa grad. So we both share the journey through those teachings and that environment, which is such a cocoon, right? And it's so needed when you're on your own healing path and studying, to be in an environment where you can really drop in and learn through your own somatic experience, right? So which you have done so beautifully. I'm also wondering, and you were talking about this path there, and the different influences that you had there, and you must have discovered some principles or some key aspects of because you focus your work a lot on trauma, right? So I'm wondering if you also kind of unearthed some principles or key aspects of what you think is really essential to be focusing on as somebody who studies this work.
Yeah. There's plenty of them. I'll hone in on a few. One of them would be restoring a felt sense of safety, right? That there's this, kind of coming home to this idea that the body is not going to release the trauma that we've accumulated, the defensiveness that we guard ourselves with, the protective layers, until we feel safe enough. And so then the question becomes, how do we foster a felt sense of safety? And some of that is around connection, right? Like that within the arena of psychotherapy, we create this experience of connection being seen, being listened to, being understood, attunement, even at this nonverbal exchange that we might have. And that there's this foundation through relationship of really feeling held by another. And so many of us have, in some way or another, a delicate relationship to those early attachment parts of our lives. It was maybe done well or not so well, or somewhere in between. And regardless, I don't think any of us come out of our early childhood completely untouched by some kind of injury or wound, let alone that at this point on the planet, most of us have generations behind us, ancestry behind us, where there's been layers of attachment wounding that has been perhaps unaddressed and unhealed, and that this kind of gets passed on forward. And I know that was certainly the case for me. So part of my own journey and what one of those keys that informs my work with others is creating that safe place where we feel so listened to and understood, or what, Carl Rogers would refer to as this unconditional ground of acceptance that then allows what is ready and ripe for healing to unfold in its own timing. Maybe timing is the lead in for another of these keys to healing trauma from an embodied perspective, which is around pace and reclaiming our own intrinsic rhythms. Right? That I believe that all of us have kind of, in a sense, built within us an intrinsic rhythm that is in relationship to how much engagement we are ready for or want to have with the world or with other, and our rhythm of disengagement coming back to self and arriving in our way of kind of integrating all that we've taken in out there in the world. And that we have this, kind of rhythm of moving outward, mobilizing into the world, connecting outward through our senses. And we have a rhythm of moving inward and metabolizing and digesting the experiences that are out there. But one of the things that happens with trauma is it disrupts these rhythms. And we get caught either in that outward facing self, or we get protective in the inward facing self and afraid to return back to the outer world because that world has hurt us. Or we've gone into that shock, right? Like, I have to stay alert and on guard and vigilant to my surroundings, because if I don't, I can't keep myself safe. So these are variations on the disruption of that healthy rhythm, which is both, as I'm describing, kind of a relational rhythm, but it's also a nervous system rhythm. When I study polyvagal theory and kind of looking at the health of the autonomic nervous system, the nervous system reflects this same rhythm of moving out and moving in. Our sympathetic nervous system mobilizes us into the world for the purpose of either sensing safety, bonding into connection, or keeping ourselves safe because we sense a threat and we need to recognize that threat and protect ourselves. And our parasympathetic system moves us inward and allows us to rest and digest and restore and sleep well. And just as we've been naming, the autonomic nervous system can also get quite dysregulated by trauma, where we get stuck in that go, go, go sympathetic, it's not okay to rest, or we get stuck in that parasympathetic collapse fatigue, where we don't know how to remobilize into the world. And it's the dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system that underlies most of our mental and emotional and physical health symptoms: anxiety, sympathetic, depression, parasympathetic, and also just health consequences, digestive disturbances, reproductive imbalances, immune system disturbances, lack of sleep, and how all of this can impair our sense of well-being. So that second key is really about reclaiming these intrinsic rhythms of self. I've got one more, but it looked like you wanted to say
Well,
something.
I'm just thinking that it's a beautiful description that you're giving there right now, and I'm thinking it's so interesting that we don't really know that in our culture, right? And it's almost like we only know parts of it, and we don't really understand this rhythm of regulation. We don't really understand it. We don't know how to take care of it, and in a way, it should be taught in schools, right? We have slivers of it, right? We have social emotional learning in school and so on, but it seems like because it's so human, what you describe is our human way of relating and processing and being in the world. It's like, why don't we know this, right? Why don't we know this in our culture? Do you have a hunch about that?
Yeah, well, we get a lot of messages, whether it's in our own internal, our own families, right? In that smaller system, maybe we get kind of quiet or implicit messages within our family system that we have to take care of other in order for our needs to get met. And so, therefore, the attention gets directed outward and gets reinforced in some way or another. Or maybe in the internal system, we, in the developmental, experience in our family, we experience that no matter what I do, I can't find that source of connection. So what's the point of trying? So it can get reinforced really early on. But in terms of this larger, more collective layer that you're asking about, I think we get a lot of reinforcement that leads us to disconnect with our intrinsic rhythms. For example, in school, sit still, pay attention, being alert, being on, focusing outward, and stillness being a sign of obedience or respect is a request to override your own rhythms of regulation. Now, some people do better than others in those kinds of environments, but when you're a kind of person that actually needs sensory stimulation in order to pay attention, that's a pretty poor learning environment, and it actually can really lead to this very distorted sense of self, or a dissociation from our own embodied experience for the sake of belonging. Right. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces. It doesn't just happen in school, it can happen in a whole lot of arenas. But belonging might be one of the biggest motivating factors that leads us to abandon self for the sake of existing within a tribe, because there's a long-based survival need to have tribal existence for survival in this world. And so, I will, in one way or another, abandon my own uniqueness, my own authentic presence for the sake of belonging, whether that's in my attachment relationship, whether that's in my family, my cultural environment in my community, or so on and so forth.
And yet, coming back to your story, you, because it's the title also, but coming back to your authentic self here, authentic being, you actually made a decision to go out and seek it.
Yeah, kind of against all odds, Manuela. I had an experience. It'll be a little revealing about my own family system. But when I chose to go to Naropa, I nearly had my father disown me. I mean, it was a absolute battle in my system. I will not pay for that school. Okay, well, I'll take out loans, right? I'm going to do it my way. And there was something very fierce in me that knew that this was my path. He has, by the way, since apologized to me. He said, I think you really knew what was right for you. Yes, I did. Thank you. That actually was worth a lot. But, I think he had that same, in a sense, wounding of, this is what's acceptable. This is the path. And it was pre-prescribed for him. And he was trying to prescribe it for me as well. And my path was not to sit in a classroom any longer where I couldn't move. It was so clear to me after I had had these embodied experiences. Now, between undergraduate and my graduate school, when I went to Naropa, I took 2 years off, and I went and worked in wilderness therapy. And so at that point, I was working with youth in the court system, adjudicated youth who opted into this wilderness program. And it was this nomadic experience of, we were basically kind of hoods in the woods, walking through the woods. I was, just a few years older than these kids that I was, their field guide, but it was also, in a lot of ways, such a healing experience for me to recognize that moving our bodies while making our way through hard stuff, myself and these kids, was really key. It was really important. There was something deeply instinctual about climbing a mountain, navigating our way over streams, needing to reckon with the elements in a sense, making fires, all of the things that were just very kind of down to earth, very back to basics. And these kids had all come from backgrounds of gang violence, domestic violence in their homes, drug and alcohol use. They all had ACE scores. This is before we even knew what ACE scores were, or at least I even knew what ACE scores were. This was in 1994. And, and as I'm working with these kids who've been emotionally abused, physically abused, some of them sexually abused, neglected, there was something important about nature as this safe container, especially when the wounds were relational, right? I can trust the earth more than I can trust another person. They'll even trust a coyote over another person. Trust me. There was something important about this larger world. And, for anyone that knows my work, nature continues to be just such a tremendous resource for me. This actually takes me into another one of those keys to healing and reclaiming that embodied authentic self, which is about building this capacity to trust yourself, to trust your instincts, to not only are we now reclaiming those rhythms of regulation through a journey of listening, but then it's also really trusting that your body holds the keys to your healing, that nobody else, not me, not you, nobody else, right, is going to tell you what your healing journey is going to look like. I can sit here, I can be a guide, I can listen with you. I'm going to offer my listening and my attunement with you, but that's going to come from within. And that it comes from creating this capacity to really, really listen and to kind of unpack those layers of conditioning that all of us received in one way or another about who we're supposed to be, so that we can actually reclaim who we are.
Well said. I'm wondering if you want to guide us a little bit into one of your practices so we get an embodied sense of what all of that you're talking about.
I would love to. Yeah. And I think I'm going to guide this here seated, just for our kind of sake for today. Although I will just let all of you here listening that to know that you can also do this standing. So as I'm inviting you to come into your own listening, your own kind of sensory processing, your own true self, that you might choose to do this practice standing or laying down. You might be in your bed listening to this, and you can do this just as easily wherever you have chosen to be. And knowing that connecting to your body might not always feel comfortable at first, it might not feel natural at first, that just setting an intention to move toward connection can be enough. And that there's nothing that you're going to there's no way to do this practice wrong, right? Like, I'm going to offer some invitations. And if your response to any of these invitations is that doesn't feel right for me or that doesn't feel comfortable, then honor that, because that's your truth, right? So the first of these invitations is to bring awareness to your experience in this moment, your own felt sense, whether that is by closing your eyes or keeping your eyes open. Maybe, like me, you want to place a hand over your heart and a hand over your belly. Maybe it's simply allowing your gaze to soften just a little bit. And that as you move your attention toward yourself, just notice what arises next. You might notice that this feels good. You might deem it in some way a positive experience, or it might not feel so comfortable or good, and that's also welcome here. So as we move toward experience, as you move toward your experience, coming in with a certain degree of curiosity about what is true for you. And the next invitation is to explore a little bit of this rhythm of going inward and coming back outward. And I'll invite you to even allow your posture to match this just a little bit. So we'll start with the inward turn, and you follow this to the degree that your body says yes. And that inward turn might be a curling toward yourself. It might be a closing your eyes just a little bit more, a curling of your shoulders. It might be much more subtle of just allowing a little bit of a descending of your awareness into the felt experience of your throat, your heart, your belly. And because our breath also mirrors these rhythms of regulation, you might get very curious about how your exhalation brings you just a little bit more inward. Just allowing the breath to come back in naturally. And as you catch the wave of your next exhalation, maybe even a sigh or a sound. Or ha, just letting something go. And again, you might notice if this invitation to follow that inward or downward momentum feels comfortable or uncomfortable. And because we're following some rhythms here, we're going to come back out and we'll return to that inward again. But the outward is an invitation to just lift your gaze, maybe open your eyes if they were closed. Maybe allow your shoulders to broaden. Maybe allow your arms to broaden. And just notice what's present for you in this shape. And this time we'll catch the wave of the inhalation. And just letting the exhale do its own thing. And again, you can allow the inhalation, the inspiration, and follow that expanse. Maybe sensing, again, along the front line of your body, that there's an invitation to open across the front of your throat or your chest, diaphragm and belly. And then coming back to what we'll call midline. We're going to do this again, but before we go back in, just a moment of noticing that contraction or inward turn, the expansion and outward turn, what they evoke for you, what emotions are present in each of those turnings, those rhythms, whether one felt more vulnerable than the other or protected than the other. And if you so choose, we're going to find those rhythms again, and we're going to move a little bit more back and forth. So we'll start again with that inward turn, the exhalation. And when you're inspired, finding the outward turn in the inhalation. And now it's up to you. And because this is your rhythmic journey that's very much honoring your truth, you might go into that curling and stay there for a few breaths, right? Just honoring. Maybe there's grief and tenderness. Maybe there's loss. And we honor, but again, knowing that you don't have to just stay in one state. You might come back out when it feels like that's enough. And we open up. And opening might feel lovely and expansive and joyful, or unprotected and a little scary, just noticing. Maybe you want to stay there longer, linger, or you want to come back into movement. You might even say the words to yourself, I am reclaiming my rhythms of engagement and disengagement, of contraction and expansion. I am listening to and honoring how my body, mind, and emotions give me feedback about how to navigate the world. Letting your breath be a guide, letting your sensations be a guide, letting your emotional tone be a teacher. And when you feel complete, there's one more layer that I'll invite you into here. Maybe coming back to any shape, position of your body that feels like a balance, a place of homecoming for you. Now, for me, that's very often a hand on my heart, a hand on my belly, but feel out for you what feels like a place of balance, where perhaps there's a little bit of both, a sensing of your relationship to other in the world, while retaining a sense of connection to yourself. You might, if you feel that you lose connection in one domain or the other, return fully to that outward or inward turn, reset, reorient, and then explore how it feels to find this both and that you get to have a self and you get to be in relationship, whether that relationship is with a person, a pet, a place in nature, this world we share. And you still have self. Mm. So taking your time, emerging from that practice, maybe taking some notes of what that brought forward for you, just reflecting.
Thank you for that practice, Ariel. Um, what I always appreciate about these practices, to me, they're not exercises, they're practices. I don't know how you think about it, but this the quality of slowing down, this quality of opening up a different way of perceiving oneself is so critical, I think, in any kind of somatic work.
It's so true. I think that even as I hear your voice, I'm like, oh yeah, oh that's so lovely. It is, and I think that so often we're going into these very automatic reactions, whether it's automatic thoughts about ourselves or automatic reactions to others, and we don't even hear what's driving them because it's so fast. So the slowing down and that opportunity to observe what is bringing the curiosity rather than the judgment, and being able to just open up space so that there's an opportunity to refine. Who do I want to be? How do I want to show up? And maybe I'm always jumping ship on myself to take care of everybody else. And maybe I don't want to keep doing that.
And it's in that recognizing of the pattern that and the slowing down that, you're calling it the authentic self coming forward or the embodied self there. I think that's when you have the opportunity to actually recognize it.
Right.
Oh, there it is. There's that, what you said earlier, that that's me, or there's home, or it's different for each person, but there's this opportunity to even recognize it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and we were naming, I was naming earlier that it often starts with having somebody else help to see us because, we can't always see ourselves in the beginning, right? We need in some ways to have that compassionate witness or somebody else who's attuning to us, because if it's such a long-standing habit, we're just living inside of it. It is just who I am. And it's not until someone else even just offers their curiosity that we illuminate a little bit of distance between that habitual sense of self, and maybe that doesn't actually have to be who I am, how I walk through the world, how I navigate relationships. Maybe there's a new possibility that's awaiting. And like I said, it doesn't mean that the other person knows what's on the other side of that newness, but is willing to stand with us in the unknown until we discover for ourselves what that truth is.
Yeah, that brings me full circle to your story, how you started about you discovered that knowing because you had this relational somatic work that woke you up, and then kind of off you went on this path, right?
I had a really sweet experience earlier this year. The turns out that the woman that taught that very first body mind centering class that I attended when I was 20 years old is the aunt of a friend of mine who I only met many years later. And she was coming to town here in Boulder, Colorado. Her name is Andrea Olson. You may know her. She's a body mind centering teacher. And we were chatting. I introduced her at her book signing at the Boulder bookstore, and we were chatting because I had shared the story there. And she goes, "Oh, you were at that workshop?" And I said, "Oh, you taught that workshop?" And it was such a full circle moment, for me, going from that initial experience at the age of 20 to meeting her at the age of 50, 30 years later, and saying to this beautiful person, "You changed my life."
That's beautiful. That's a wonderful full circle.
It's
Powerful, lovely. Well, listen, I could talk to you forever and listen also to your teachings, and it's so clear how you have been, not just studying this work, but living this work from your own soma. And I think that is such an important part of being a somatic therapist, that you do your own practice, you come from your own somatic experiences, right? So, and it's so evident in how you talk, how you guide, how you teach, that you come from a very embodied, lived place within you. It's beautiful. So thank you for all this gorgeous work that you do out there in the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you for saying all that. I feel very seen.
Well, I want to kind of ask you if there's anything you'd like to share, or any new projects that you're involved in that you want people to know about, or how people can find you.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I'll say is that I have a whole lot of projects that I've been doing here with the Shift Network that have been just a pure delight. We've been doing these vagal toning courses that incorporate this essence of the polyvagal theory and bring that right into um, kind of the very practical tools that you can use to reclaim that embodied authentic self and reclaim those rhythms of regulation that we've been speaking about. And then I have courses that I teach on the applied polyvagal theory in yoga that are even, kind of taken onto the yoga mat, and how we engage in a yoga practice, not from a prescribed set of asanas, but from more of an authentic movement perspective. And then, me, I'm always writing a book or two. So there's lots of tools out there. I would say for our listeners that you can find a lot of my offerings on my website and also on my YouTube channel. And you're welcome to join me for my regular yoga classes, which you can learn about on my website as well, or take those as recordings on the YouTube channel, which is at Dr. Ariel Schwartz.
Thank you. Given what you all talked about, from the personal to the teacher to all the guidance that you just did, that beautiful practice, what would you like the listener to take away? Is there some kind of pithy instruction or some kind of bookmark you'd like to have people go away with?
Yeah. That I think two things. One is that there is no wrong response, right? That if anything ever feels like, oh gosh, that stirred up something uncomfortable within me, that too becomes the access point to the next place of healing. So even the pain, so long as you can broaden enough into support to hold it, becomes the doorway to the whole self. And I think the other thing that I would say is that healing is really possible. Right? It may take time, which is sometimes the barrier of just feeling like, is this going to, how many layers of this onion do I have to peel before I feel like I'm resolved? And trust me, 30 years into this embodiment journey, there's many layers to that onion. I see you nodding, Manuela, but also that it becomes this beautiful unfolding rather than only in service of our suffering. We actually can, each layer unfolds another layer of grace.
Very wise words. Thanks, Ariel, for your time and your beautiful work. And what a wonderful session with Ariel Schwartz. And thank you all for listening today.
Thanks, Manuela.